Now we can go into the people of Socrates and Plato. So let me switch here. We're going to start with Plato, who is the writer of this work, though he was born after Socrates. And ultimately, we don't really know much about Socrates, so there's not a whole lot to say about his life, unfortunately. Most of what we know from Plato. Plato was born in 428 BC, and interestingly, he was not just a mere rabble of the Athenian city-state. He was from a quite distinguished family, which interestingly had an alleged ancestor that included the god Poseidon. So his lineage apparently traces to a god. And of course, the best I can make of this is it's something like the American grandmother claiming some relationship to Jesse James, as mine did. And I know many other American grandmothers from the early 1900s may have claimed, because I don't know why American grandmothers like to be related to Jesse James, but it just seems to be some staple, or at least uncannily common claim made by our American grandmothers. Jesse James wasn't even that great of a dude as far as I could tell. He's kind of took the law into his own hands many times, which maybe at some times is necessary, but I think ultimately I'd probably want him behind bars if I had the choice, if I lived around his time and in his place. Regardless, I think this is probably a common thing among nobility as well. They probably often claim some lineage to a god. You can think of it as having some particular connection to a god and probably seeking extra favors from that god, is my guess. But it also probably provides you some cool leverage to tell your friends that, I'm from so-and-so family from the lineage of Poseidon. Anyway, he grew up during this Peloponnesian War, where we witnessed the shattering of the Athenian Empire and that strife between the oligarchs and democrats. And ultimately, this would all play into his later politics, or disdain for politics, as we'll find out. And interesting, one of his relatives was Critias, and another Charmides, but the Critias was a student of Socrates, as I just told you, who was one of the 30. And Plato was also at this trial according to Plato's work, of course. So we're taking his word for it that he really was at this trial in the words of Socrates. Of course, all the words of Socrates, let me clarify that all the words of Socrates we have are through Plato's writing. So it's ultimately Plato putting those words either in Socrates' mouth or accurately recording the words of Socrates. This is also why it's so difficult to separate the thoughts of Plato and Socrates, in my opinion, because I can't imagine he was writing this down as the trial went on. He probably recalled a lot of this and probably dressed it up a little bit as well. Most Greek historians and ancient historians in general tended to dress up their history as well. So I think that's probably what's going on with this trial of Socrates as well. Plato probably inserted a few things for effect, or just merely to clean it up. But Plato had early ambitions in politics. His relatives were leaders in the tyranny of the 30. Again, that was 404 BC. So he was about, in his 20s around that time. And interestingly, he was actually even offered to join them in the 30. I don't know if he was offered to be one of the 30. That seems like a stretch, but he was probably joined to have some smaller role under the 30s, my guess. Wisely, he did not accept it immediately, and he waited until their ultimate policies were revealed, which led to him being repulsed by their policies and their violence. As again, they were very cruel, killing something like 5% of the Athenian population. And the condemnation of Socrates by the Democrats later revealed to Plato that he could really get along with either of them. So Plato was really put off by politics at a fairly young age. Again, probably his 20s or something. I guess he would have been, throughout his 20s, he was undergoing this discernment between the tyranny of the 30, which again only lasted 8 months. Luckily, he didn't take part of it. And then this combination of Socrates by the Democrats. So ultimately, this dampened his goals in politics. He was put off by the what he would think of probably as utter corruption of the government. Instead, he decided to take up his travels, and he headed off to Italy and Sicily. But according to Plutarch, who I really loved reading, I highly recommend going to read some Plutarch as soon as possible. He may have even gone to Egypt. Again, these are all connected by the Mediterranean Sea, so it seems plausible that he could have sailed from Italy and Sicily to Egypt, or perhaps in the reverse order. But the most important thing he did in Italy was to meet a friend and future friend, but also foe later, Dion. He then returned to Athens to found the academy, the famous academy, in 387, and probably had finished some of his writings by that time. He may have written the Apology by that time, but I couldn't find a real date put on the writing of Apology or many of Plato's works. But he wrote them at some point, probably by the time he was established in the academy. This academy served as a central part of his life, as most of us would probably think of him. That's what he's perhaps most famous for besides his works. And he reportedly lectured with no notes. So I think of him as some genius professor. If you've ever been in a physics class or something, you know the extra genius that comes with not requiring any notes on the part of your professor. He just has it all in his head. But the general idea of the academy was Plato as this professor type character putting forth research questions toward his students that they could study and then begin to answer. The academy studied philosophy, law, and mathematics, and was sought by the broader world commonly for legislative advice, which again later will bring Plato kind of back into politics, mostly against his will. In fact, but this came through his old friend Dion. Dion was close to the new king of Syracuse, Dionysius II. And he wanted Plato to join him in helping to tutor this two king. Plato reluctantly agreed because of two things. One, his friendship with Dion, whom again he met in Italy. And two, he says, lest I might someday appear to myself wholly and solely a man of mere words. So he didn't want to be a hypocrite, and he wanted to actually practice what he preached. Plato, in his teaching role of the new king, unfortunately quickly led him into politics. As you can imagine, if you're teaching the king how to read, write, and think, essentially, he's ultimately going to bounce his ideas about the running of his kingdom off you as well. And that's exactly what happened. And ultimately, Plato was brought into the state affairs of Syracuse, and hence into politics, where he originally wanted to be, but was quickly turned away by the goings-on of Athens. His political stint in Syracuse ended sadly from disagreements with Dion and Dionysius II. I don't believe the initial order of the falling out. Eventually, he was done with it all and returned to the academy until his death around 347 BC. Where we must note, of course, when talking about Socrates, you have to talk about Plato, and when talking about Plato, you have to at least mention the name Aristotle, who was at that same academy around the same time. Probably around 367 BC or so. Of course, we're going to be getting to Aristotle in the future. He's certainly on the reading list here, so I don't imagine many episodes will pass by without talking about Aristotle's works. That's it for Plato. Let's briefly talk a little bit about. Here's first of all, show this. This is the School of Athens. That's the academy. I don't know how realistic this depiction is. This is a painting by Raphael, the famous Raphael in 1510 or so, and shows Plato in our middle here talking with the young Aristotle, as we just mentioned. And you can see they're all kind of these, I think of these guys sort of like hippie philosophers. They're all probably drinking wine or whatever around the academy and discussing the latest research problems proposed to them by the great Plato.